Now, when it comes to effective communication, most people associate with that what we say and even how we say it with voice and tone. And some even communicate with body and would include that in their definition. However, today we are talking about something that not many actually consider when it comes to effective communication, and that is listening. And we are joined by somebody who has dedicated his research and his work, his speaking, training, and workshops on exactly that topic, how to better listen to increase your influence and also your impact. Oscar Trimboli is this week's guest. Thank you so much for being here, Oscar.
G'day, Petra. Looking forward to listening to your questions.
I'm on my feet, let's put it that way. But I'm super curious. Like, most people are so concerned about what to say and how to sound really smart and very sophisticated words to throw out there to be seen as trustworthy and to be the authority in their space. However, you turn this topic on its head. How did you get into that space? How did you discover the power of listening?
Well, my boss actually listened to me. I was in a boardroom in Microsoft. It's April 2008. And we're setting the annual budget for the subsidiary. We're doing a video conference between Sydney, Seattle, and Singapore. And these meetings are scheduled for about 90 minutes. They typically run over because we want to set the budget in the meeting. If you can imagine rows of people on computer, laptops, punching into spreadsheets in the background with some people in the foreground kind of debating, negotiating, in this environment, the country level budget, you want to set it at a realistic level. You want stretch, but equally, if you don't set a realistic budget, people will lose their jobs. So this is a pretty tense environment. It's considered it's a thoughtful environment, and there's a lot of debate that goes on. The global office is trying to stretch to get the most impact possible. And at the 20-minute mark, my vice president, she looked me straight in the eye across the boardroom table in the room and said, "Oscar, we need to talk immediately after this meeting." Mm. Which for the men out there, that's the equivalent of, "Honey, we need to talk." From that point on in the meeting, I listened to nothing. The only thing I was writing down was, how many weeks' salary have I got left? What are my expenses? Because I'm about to get fired. Now, something interesting happened. The meeting finished a little early. It was unusual. And as people kind of filed out the room, I tried to do the same. And Tracy kind of said, "Hey, Oscar, make sure you close that door when you come back and sit down." And as I stepped back towards the desk, she said to me, "You have no idea what you did at the 20-minute mark." And I thought, great, I'm getting fired and I don't know why. I sat down and she said, "If you could code how you listen, you could change the world." And as profound a moment of listening as it was on Tracy's behalf, the only thing going through my mind, Petra, was, woohoo, I haven't been fired. Now, because I wasn't listening, I got a bigger increase in my budget and I didn't kind of think anything much of it. So that's where it started. 2 weeks later, my finance director said to me, "Come and audit my listening in the budget meeting." And from that point on, I've been honoring Tracy's request and I've been coding listening, and we've got 27,000 people globally who've now taken the listening quiz to understand what gets in their way when it comes to listening.
Oh my God, I love this story. And my heart literally sank when you say we need to talk, because this is usually this, something is going wrong. You are, in a bad situation. So, but it actually turns it around. So that's fascinating. Having said that, there are still doubters who think, I'm not sure if listening is that important. And I know you've done a lot of research. Can you throw out some of the fascinating facts that you have found out during your research?
Look, most people aren't even conscious of the cost of not listening. If you're in a commercial enterprise or a public sector enterprise, the costs are very similar. In commercial organization, reduced profitability, rework, having to re-explain yourself over and over again, great staff leaving before they want to, getting the wrong customers who are unprofitable, losing customers who are profitable because the customers listen to them better. And in the public sector, it's policies that don't achieve their full potential or their objectives. They do it in a more costly way, staff leaving before they want to. And many of us are not conscious of a very simple bit of research. If you know this, you can literally switch off the podcast and You don't have to listen to anything after this. If people know that listening is an art and a science, and this is the science part of listening, this is the difference between somebody's speaking speed and their thinking speed. So when you're listening to somebody speaking to you, they speak between 125 and 150 words per minute. They can think up to 9 times faster at 900 words per minute. That means the first thing they say in that first minute is 14% of what they're thinking. That means in that first minute, you're missing 86% of what they're thinking. And if you want to jump in and have a conversation about that first 14%, you're probably going to have a conversation that might go around in a circle. You're probably going to have a conversation that takes longer than it needs to. You're probably going to have a conversation about something that they say that's effectively what you would type into a text message. But it's not really thought through. It's not really considered. It's not even rehearsed. And yet we're all having a conversation with 14%. Now, I don't know about you, Petra, but I prefer my odds of success to be greater than 14%. So if you want to waste time at work, here's a quick way to check. Are you in back-to-back meetings? It's probably because you're not listening. Are your meetings running over? It's probably because you're not listening. Are you struggling to find time in your weekend when you're not working? It's probably because you're not listening. Are you struggling to attract great people into your team? It's probably because you're not listening. Communication is 50% speaking and 50% listening. Yet by the age of 30, most people have had no training in the workplace on how to listen. And by the age of 50, only 2% of people have had any training on how to listen in the workplace. So there's big upside. Our deep listening ambassador community say they can report up to 4 hours a week back in their schedule because their meetings are shorter and their relationships get bigger impacts.
This is fascinating. And to be honest, I've been following your work for quite some time. And I remember, as it was yesterday, it was probably 6 years ago that I listened to a podcast and you spoke about exactly those insights with the words. I was like, oh my gosh, this is me. Because I think so quickly, if I can say that for myself, and I also speak very quickly. So when somebody speaks very slowly, I'm thinking, what do I have to do for dinner? And I need to do this and that. And I'm switching off. And I caught myself like, oops, he called me out here. So why is it that I think most of us struggle with that we are in so many thoughts and don't necessarily listen to anything what is said, or think, oh, we know it already, what's been said anyway?
Yeah. Look, we all love music and we know great bands and great orchestras, and all of them tune their instruments before they go into a performance. They give themselves 3 to 5 minutes, no matter if they've played in that same location with the same music, with the same band, with the same instrument on the same day, they still tune their instrument every time the first violin taps their bow and everybody starts to tune. It's an act of professionalism. It's an act of self-respect. It's an act of mutual respect for the other performers as well. But it brings your mindset to something different is going to happen. So let's get ready. The reason most people struggle with their listening is they think listening starts with you focusing on the speaker. It's interesting, but it's unproductive if you haven't listened to yourself. Like Petra, a lot of you have got all these browser tabs opened in your mind, and those browser tabs, they're using your memory. And what you need to do is shut them down in a deliberate ritual. Now, the reason I talk about tuning and orchestras and bands is the fastest way you can tune yourself in for the next conversation. Just play a 3-minute musical song. That will rewire your brain really quickly and shut down the browser tabs. For bonus points, drink a glass of water, take 3 deep breaths. Whether you're an opera singer, an Olympic athlete, or a Navy SEAL, they all use deliberate breathing techniques and hydration to get themselves ready for peak performance. Now you're ready to go into the conversation. In that state of mind, you're available to go, okay, my presence is here. Here's a dirty little secret. Great listeners change the way the speaker communicates their idea. Great listeners hear what the speaker thinks and what they mean, not just what they bullet the first time.
Mhm.
But if you're busy thinking about what to have for lunch or what's the point you want to make and all these other things bouncing around in your browser tab, you won't be available to listen. So if you can get ready, you're at least setting yourself up for success. Planning matters. Listening happens before, during, and after the conversation. Good listeners think it happens in the dialogue, and great listeners think about listening as a process, not just an act of communication.
I love the metaphors and how you explain it, because it's so true. We're just running from one meeting to the next, and it's often also context switching. We're doing completely different tasks and we expect to perform at our highest level all the time. And this is not possible. So switching off, turning the distractions off, and then focusing on what's next, that certainly helps being more productive and being present. Now, in your research, in your book, you also mentioned that there are villains when it comes to listening. What are those villains?
So villains are just ways for us to personify what gets in the way of people's listening. We've researched over 2,500 people in deep conversational kind of conversations. So we call that qualitative research, but we also did quantitative research where we asked people to score themselves and others on how they listen, and more importantly, what gets in the way. So the research, just listening to the research, they came up with these 4 villains of listening: the dramatic villain, the interrupting villain, the lost villain, and the shrewd villain. Each of those can be found if you pop on to listeningquiz.com and do the 7-minute quiz yourself. But I'll just spend a little bit of time describing each of them. In each case, their superpower may also be their undermining. So the dramatic listener loves to form connections, loves to connect around emotion, and says something like, "Yeah, same thing happened to me, Petra. Let me tell you about the time when..." And all of a sudden, the spotlight's moved off Petra onto the person who's listening to them. What the research participants tell us is the phrase they use most consistently is, they're not listening. They're just trying to make it all about them. Now, what they're trying to do is actually find a common link and connection so that there is some way that the conversation or rapport can build up, but they're doing it too early. So there's nothing wrong with trying to form connection. It's exposing how you think you're connected when they fully haven't explained what the real issue is. A lot of people say they shows up regularly in pubs on Friday nights, and everybody likes to move to them. The interrupting listener values time the most. So they're trying to anticipate the question and they're jumping ahead. They're like the quiz show contestant that presses the buzzer, gets in early, and gets it wrong because they answered the wrong question. The friction they create in the survey respondents say, if they just waited a little longer, I know they may know the answer, but they're often answering the wrong question. The lost listening villain is the third. The lost person doesn't understand their role in the conversation, and they should ask the other person, what do you need from me in this conversation? This shows up for me with my brother-in-laws. They bang on about religion very regularly when I see them, and it's the religion of Canon versus Nikon. They talk about photography like in a way that I just don't understand. My idea of photography is the iPhone. And, you know, in that conversation, I'm very vague, I'm distant, I'm detached. But if they said to me, what do you think, Oscar? Sometimes I'll go, is that a setting on the iPhone? Or they'll just ask me to go and get them a couple of drinks. Now, the shrewd listening villain is a problem-solving machine. A very close cousin to the interrupting listener. The difference is they're a little bit more subtle. They'll sit there and go, yeah, fascinating. In their mind, they're problem-solving. and what the speakers say about the shrewd listening villain. By the way, this is disproportionately represented in any manager community, any sales community, any consulting community, any human resources community, any accounting, finance community. They are trained to be problem solvers. And what the speakers say about the shrewd listening villain is they're trying to fix me. They're not actually listening. They're trying to fix me. So notice they don't say, I'm trying to fix the problem. They're trying to fix me. And they perceive the shrewd listening villain as quite judgmental. At work, I'm a shrewd listening villain. And at home, I'm a lost listening villain. So that's how the quiz shows up for me.
Those insights are fascinating. And even though you've done this research now over years, I think it's now more relevant than ever before with the future of work and the current state of work, where we have global teams, we've got distributed teams, we've got leaders who have been in that space for 2 years, but it's not necessarily because of their experience and their knowledge on the topic. It's because they know how to curate conversations, how to get insights from the wider team. And that requires a big mindset shift also. So leadership in this day and age and or tomorrow's world is more about listening and asking the right questions rather than having all the answers. And so many are struggling with that. And whilst you went through all the villains, I thought of quite a few of my clients who was like, oh yeah, this is person XYZ here and here, because you can see that straight away in their leadership style. What have you found out with working with leaders, how they can actually, obviously doing the test, but then also see when they trap into their natural habitat, how can they get out of the spiral and actually focus on the conversation and shift to listen and to ask questions rather than having all the answers or thinking of all the solutions already?
Yeah. Look, if you don't mind, it's just a bit of fun for you listening. Notice how Petra said, while she was listening, she went and allocated all her clients there. This is a really good example of a shrewd listening villain role modeled for you. So that's a beautiful example of how a shrewd listener would be listening to the way I described to each villain there. So no intention to embarrass you, Petra, and my apologies if it did. Back to your question. Imagine someone came to you and said 3 is half of 8.
Okay.
What's your immediate reaction, Petra?
How did you come to that conclusion?
Now, what we've just heard is, Petra, is what they said true or false?
False.
Okay. So what we've just heard is a simple conversation that could happen in the workplace. Somebody brings you some insight, some knowledge, and says 3 is half of 8. Now, because Petra listened for similarity and not difference, she immediately went back into her experience set and came to the conclusion that the statement is false. 3 is not half of 8. Yet if you are conscious enough to listen for similarity and difference, you may be open to the possibility that 3 is half of 8. Now, Petra, my suspicion is your heuristic is based on mathematics.
I hope so.
Okay. Now, Petra, 3 is half of 8. Look at that through the lens of geometry now. And what I want you to imagine is a figure 8. And what I want you to do is put a line through the figure 8 vertically from top to bottom. And if you were to separate the 8 in half, you would see a 3 and a 3. And geometrically, 3 is half of 8. Now, you could actually turn the 8 on its side, and 0 would be half of 8 as well. You could put a dividing line horizontally through an 8. But for each of you, you all, or at least the Harvard implicit bias assessment will say 92% of you will jump to the same conclusion. Is 4 half of 8? Yes. Can 3 be half of 8? No. because our primary listening filter is to listen for similarity based on our history, our education, our family upbringing, our culture, all these kinds of things. When you're in a workplace as a leader, people will regularly come up to you and say 3 is half of 8. And you always say, how did you come to that conclusion? And you won't say, I'm really curious. How did you come to that conclusion? Taking the time to understand what they think and what they mean is vital. When we do this, we expose our assumptions, which is the edge of our mental models on any conversation, and it helps the person who's speaking with us to do the same. When we do, we reduce confusion, we reduce conflict, we reduce chaos, because in our modern world where we collaborate and we coexist in competitive and cooperative situations where resources are constrained, we need to be listening for similarity and difference. And we need to lead in a way that makes it safe for our teams to speak up when they think something doesn't make sense for them. Not because they know that you're the expert and you're going to have the answers, but you're going to create a container in which you can have a conversation where either you and them, or you, them and the team, or an extended team can progress where you want to go. But if you say, oh my God, here they go again with this 3 is half of 8 stuff. Take some time, notice you're listening for similarity, and go, if I listen for difference, what else could I do? A lot of people say, oh, Oscar, this takes too much time. I'm in back-to-back meetings. The reason you're in back-to-back meetings is because all you're doing is listening for similarity. And if you just paused and started to listen for difference, you may get some of the breakthrough and transformational ideas that give you some time back.
I love those insights. And, it reminds me on the statement context before content. Like when we don't know what's the context, what we're about to discuss, we don't know if it's right or wrong, interesting, relevant or not, but we're straight jumping into a conclusion straight away. And that is often not the right conclusion. So thanks so much for explaining this example. And I was like, oh, of course, it makes sense with the 3 and the 8. That's been fascinating. Now, with leaders, I would love to know, firstly, what is the actual definition of deep listening, and how can we practice to be a better and deeper listener?
Well, active listening is paying attention to what people say, and deep listening is noticing what people don't say. Active listening focuses on the 14%. Deep listening notices the 86%. It requires great consciousness to go, there are things that haven't been said by this person in front of me, or more importantly, in group meetings, if you're leading them, who hasn't spoken up early enough? Because often there will be people, who hang back, very considered, very thoughtful. And at about the 40-minute mark in a 1-hour meeting, when the extroverts have processed how they think by speaking out aloud, they'll say something like, I'm curious, we haven't discussed anything about the customer in this conversation. And the meeting blows up. And the meeting blows up and feels derailed. It feels like a hand grenade, because if that person would have spoken earlier, that could have been incorporated in the group dialogue. When you hang back in the conversation and speak a bit later because you're a processor and a synthesizer, that may be comfortable for you, but it's not productive for the group. So listen in a way that brings those questions in earlier. And the point being, deep listening leaders will bring those perspectives in much earlier, because they want to listen to who hasn't spoken up much sooner, rather than waiting for the back half of the meeting.
A follow-up question on that, like, how can you ensure to not put people on the spot? Because not everyone actually wants to say something, or they don't feel quite adequate, or they don't have the right words just yet. They still need to process it. How can you see if people are ready and you're not embarrassing or putting them on the spot, versus, no, we just accept silence?
Yeah, so I'll give you a couple of practical techniques, and this is in the context of group meetings.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is called queuing. As the leader, signal the question you want the group to respond to as early as possible. Team, today I'm going to ask you for your input on this product change, on this program change, on this project change. I'm going to ask in the following order. I will either go around the room in the way everybody's there, or we'll go around the room in alphabetical by first name order. That way everybody knows when they're going. Yeah. Equally, what I want you to do is, as we go around the room, build on rather than add to. If somebody said something you find insightful, great, acknowledge that, please. You may say, I don't have anything to add. That will be a completely acceptable response. But I think for many of us, our success is bringing a range of ideas. So acknowledge the idea that's been useful for you and bring your idea in. Now, by setting up the queue, people go, okay, I know what's expected of me. I know when I'm expected to speak, and I know how to dialogue into that because the leader has explained that for me. So that's one technique. That technique is when the group is at a stage that isn't new, that they're known to each other. When the group isn't, I would recommend this technique. Team, today we're going to talk about the big change that we're going to bring to the project, the program, the product. It's a big change. I'd like you to go into your thinking in a really deliberate way. What I want you to do is capture your thinking in 2 to 3 sentences. I want you to write it down. Just be by yourself. And I know for some of you that's easier, and for some of you that's uncomfortable. That's okay, because what we will do after that, we'll just get you to share that in a pair. And that's designed to help us understand where everybody's coming. What I want to discover through this process is, where are the common issues and where are the left field issues we haven't considered. Particularly for groups that are new in their formation cycle, there's a very simple exercise to allow people to be by themselves and then increase what's at risk for them very slowly by only sharing in pair rather than the group. People are more comfortable sharing just within a pair. And then ultimately you bring that up to the group level and get everybody to share back what was common and what was different. Now, not enough people invest the time to do that. A fast version of that is just to literally get people to write things on sticky notes. The people will write things on sticky notes they would never say out aloud.
Oh, these tips are so practical and so tactical, like everyone can use it. And I love that, because it's all about the preparation and getting people into the right mindset and headspace, and also creating psychological safety. I'm not just dropping a bomb on you and you don't know it, so you are completely caught off guard, and then you go into the spiral of, oh my God, am I getting fired, or do they hate me, or whatever else is, and not focus on the task on hand. Now, we actually did listen, and we put questions out there a week ago and asked the audience, what is it that you are interested in learning more about when it comes to deep listening? And one of the questions I want to throw in now, because it's the perfect context, was, how can you create an inclusive space where everyone's voice is heard and valued, breaking through any communications barriers? And I would say, especially in this global team environment that we currently operate in, that's more prevalent and more difficult than ever before.
So super practical, tactical in that context. You just described global team working together. Please put on closed captions in your video conferencing software. And that's got nothing to do with languages. That's so all of us can catch up with what they thought they just missed somebody saying. And then you can just pop down and look at the closed caption. You've got the context. Right, I understood what they said. They didn't mispronounce it. That is what they mean. Equally, when someone's home language isn't the video conference spoken language, a lot of these platforms, Teams, Zoom, Google Meets, WebEx, all these platforms have very sophisticated near real-time captioning. That's a really simple way to create another opportunity to listen to the speaker. Now, we also talked about some of the techniques we just discussed as well, but I do want to ensure, again, in a group meeting, ask this question. If you can, ask before the meeting. Depending on the size of the meeting, you may need to ask it before. If it's a meeting bigger than, say, 6 people, you're probably going to have to ask it before in a more formal way. Go around the room and ask this question. What would make this a great conversation? Now, it's important to use that precise language rather than what would make this a great conversation for you. We don't want them answering from their perspective. We want them answering it from the group's perspective. As you go around the room, people will say, hey, I know we've got an agenda, but we get stuck in the big picture stuff. By the end of this meeting, I want some concrete detail. As the leader, you write that down. You note that. You use that as a guiding compass in the conversation. And when we're in the detail for too long, you acknowledge that person's comment at the 20-minute mark and go, thanks, Petra. At the beginning of the meeting, you said we'd get stuck up here in flight mode, up here in the clouds. We need to bring it down to the detail. So you've signaled to the group, you've listened to Petra, and you're probably going to listen to everybody else. Now, here's the dirty little secret of this. You are not asking this question for you as a leader. You are asking this question so the group listens to each other. A good meeting host gets everybody to listen to them. A great meeting host gets everybody to listen to each other. Because the host will go, right? The manager will be out of the room, but this team needs to still work together. So create the bonds across the group. As you go around and ask everybody what will make this a great meeting, all of a sudden, everybody's already had the chance to speak in the meeting. They're warmed up. That simple technique becomes the North Star for the conversation. And at every 10 minutes in a 1-hour meeting, at every 7 minutes in a half-an-hour meeting, just check in with your notes and go, how are we tracking against that? And whether your tracking is off or on, say to the group, hey, thinking about what would make this a great meeting at the beginning of the conversation, it seems like we're on track. I just want to check in with everyone. Is that the case? You'll just go around and see nods, or in a virtual environment, hey, give me a thumbs up or a virtual thumbs up if you think we're on track. You'll be able to see in body language. You'll be able to see in the way they engage whether or not they actually are. But that simple step at the beginning, what will make this a great conversation, sounds like it makes the meeting longer. Paradoxically, it makes it shorter.
Absolutely. And for anyone who has been multitasking, has not deep listened to this, rewind back. You still said it on a podcast and listen to that again, because you're so spot on with in leadership, facilitation, the host. It's not about you. It's about listening to each other, because they are the ones who are actually delivering the outcome, working together. So that's been gold. Now, that also leads us into the second and last question that we had from the audience. How does word selection and body language help you listen and understand what is said and what's not being said? And I would probably add that to the next level, because you mentioned the virtual environments where we don't necessarily have the cameras on, or we don't see people in their actual natural habitat with body language. How can we pick up on that?
Well, there's 2 distinct parts of that question. One is about word selection, and the other one's about body language. So what I would suggest is there's 5 levels of listening. Level 1, listening to yourself. Level 2, listening to the content. That's about what you hear, what you see, and what you sense. And then from level 3, 4, and 5, we're listening 4 things. So at level 1, we're listening to ourselves. At level 2, we're listening to content. At level 3, 4, and 5, we're listening 4 things: 4 context, 4 unsaid, and 4 meaning. Here's the tips I would provide. First, when it comes to word selection. Word selection is listening at a very, very advanced level. In our database of 27,000 people, We know only 4% of people can listen to contextual language. Are they talking consistently in positives or negatives, future or past, problem or solution, me or them? This is a very advanced technique. Occasionally, you might pick up on a word. What I want you to do is just notice when their language changes from their normal pattern of language. So if they're normally talking really in a measured, slow, and deliberate way, and all of a sudden they start to speak really quickly, that's a signal that something has changed for them. Something has come up that has changed the pattern. Notice what that is. So be careful. Unless you've mastered levels 1 and 2, it's very difficult to start to listen into word selection. I would say, Petra, for the vast majority of us listening, we're in the 96% of the world that's kind of struggling at listening to things. And when we say listening to content, we're talking about hearing, seeing, and sensing. Hearing, auditory, seeing, body language, sensing, emotion. So in that context, I'm going to talk about it in a group meeting context and in a face-to-face context versus a video conference setup as well. When it comes to face-to-face, is make sure that there's no barriers between you and the other person, both visually and auditory, meaning are your ears and eyes at roughly the same level? That is, are you standing above them? Are you talking down? Or is everybody at the same level in the room? That's a really critical thing. When you want to notice for body language, it is too easy to use the horoscope version of body language. Arms folded, leaning back, leaning forward, arms up to the right and to the left. All of those have no scientific basis whatsoever. If you go into the work of Professor Paul Ekman, who's the leader in this field, he's written over 18 books on the topic. He talks about the fact that practitioners who understand Paul's work, sure, they can do that, but they study for like 2 years. So don't do the pop quiz version of body language. Here's what Professor Ekman, here's what Chris Voss, FBI hostage negotiator, would say. Notice the baseline of their body language and notice when people vary from that baseline in their body language. If they lean in and they're really intent and they're taking notes, but all of a sudden they stop, there's a body language signal for you in a face-to-face situation. Now, when it comes to virtual, when it comes to video conference specifically, you get different body language signals. If you are the host of the meeting, you are the only one who should be in gallery view. You should be instructing your group to be in active speaker view. This will reduce their distraction when it comes to listening. Otherwise, they're looking at themselves in a mirror, which no human ever does when they speak face to face, the way we've been brought up for millennia. So as a host, make sure that everybody's in gallery view. Number 2, there are so many body language signals you can get simply by having webcams on or off. A good host will force everybody to put your webcams on so we can all see you. That's not about you at all. A good host will realize that we're all adults and we'll put our webcams on if we want to, or I could be just completely drained and don't know how to use the hide self-view feature in these platforms, so I don't have to look at my face. But equally, it's a signal to go, some of the group might be tired. You're getting body language signals, whether the webcam is on or off, by the way. Second thing is, don't use those corporate sterile backgrounds. Don't use the blurry background, because all you do as a human is go, and you can look at the Zoom fatigue research for this from Stanford University. What are they hiding in their background? Oh, look, they moved a bit. I can see just behind them. Yeah, right. This is what you do.
Yeah.
Which means you're not listening. What you are looking as a human is for other signals in the background. The other thing, finally, I would say is great hosts encourage the use of emoticons. And using emoticons is a way to signal nonverbals in a virtual environment. But unless the leader role models that, invites during the conversation, you're missing on a massive opportunity. So when it comes to body language in a virtual environment, I think you don't get less, you get different signals if you're a skilled facilitator. So a simple technique I use when I present to groups of people I don't know, which is the majority of the time, I will say in the chat, write down the one thing you want to improve in your listening. Now, Petra, I will have literally hundreds in the chat, and there is no way I can read any of them or all of them. But what I say next is, put a thumbs up or give a heart next to the comment you feel is the closest to the second one thing you want to improve today. And in the background, the host of the meeting has been instructed to look at those things, and they come back to me and say, hey, Oscar, the 3 things this group wants to hear about is change the whole presentation to answer those 3 questions. I can't read over 100, but I can read how the group voted. Now, to me, that's a body language, an example of virtual body language as the group claps an idea or cheers an idea virtually. We need to expand our mind about the possibilities of body language in a virtual environment. I think we just need to experiment just a little bit more. Is there any one of those ideas you might steal, Petra?
All of them. And what I love about what you just explained and the tips that you've given is that you've connected your research that you conducted years ago with what's happening right now and continue to evolve as we grow up as society. Because a few years ago, Zoom meetings weren't a thing, and now we cannot live without them anymore. But that means, how can I connect the dots between what was always the truth to what is now the truth and the reality? And you staying curious all the time and refining your own research and your own insights is absolutely fantastic. I could listen to you for another few hours.
Well, just finally to close that one off, we've written a 105-page guide, how to listen as a host in a Zoom meeting, where we talk about all of those techniques if you want to go and find that on our store.
Absolutely. Now, this leads me into my final question. Everyone is probably sitting on their chairs now. It's like, I need to learn how to listen better. Where do we start? Like, what are the resources that you would recommend other than your incredible book, which I've devoured in a second? I got it. It's like, this is mine. Thank you for that. But where else can we find you?
Just visit listeningquiz.com, do the 7-minute listening quiz, discover what your primary and secondary listening barriers are, and you'll get a 5-page report that's tailored to your barriers with 3 very prescriptive, you've heard examples of this already, tips about what you do based on your primary and secondary listening barriers. It only takes you 7 minutes. That's the maximum anyone's ever done. On average, most people complete it in 5, and that's listeningquiz.com.
Beautiful. And there's no excuse if we don't have the time, because that can literally shave thousands of hours of our times if we can get that right. Oscar, thank you so much for your insights and everything that you do. I'm very excited to learn more about and from you.
Thanks for listening.